I'm very happy to be here with all of you. My name is Sara Wolkenfeld. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria, and I'm really grateful to YCT for inviting me here tonight, here onto Zoom, but to be with all of you, and very grateful to all of you for joining. Our plan tonight is to talk about Korech, which I believe to be an underappreciated part of the Seder. It's a good part of the Seder in that it involves food, and we all know that food is a very important component of the Seder. But it's not quite the meal, and it's also sort of post-Magid, and so I think it gets kind of skipped over and a little bit underappreciated. Again, any part of the Seder that has food, I think gets a fair amount of attention. And by the way, just you can wave at me if you actually secretly or not so secretly like the taste of Korech. I would put myself in that category. I actually really like it, but I think it's just because I'm so hungry at that point in the night since I don't actually like matzah. Oh, Rhonda said she loves it. Great. So I would say that I feel like I love it. I'm not sure I actually love it. I think I'm just starving by that point. But the fact that it has food involved is definitely something that it has going for it. But again, it's not one of like the meaty parts of the Seder, right? We'll get back to why it's not meaty in a few minutes. So it kind of gets glossed over, and my job here tonight is to convince you that actually Korech is one of the most meaningful parts of the Seder. It's the most meaningful sandwich you'll ever eat, and we will get right into it. I'll just encourage you to stay muted because there's so many of us, but also to please feel free to use the chat. You can chat to me, you can chat to each other. I might pause for a few minutes at the end for questions, but even those will probably be best through chat since there could be a lot of chaos with unmuting. So feel free to keep your comments coming through the chat as I speak and as I ask questions and then answer them myself, but I really would much rather that you answer them. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen now. Yes, I appreciate the joke about the Jews creating the first sandwich. I also feel that way. I don't know if it's the first sandwich, but again, I want to convince you that it's definitely the most meaningful sandwich, and I really believe that. So what is this sandwich? Here's the text of Korech. It's not much of a text. Again, it's not one of our meatier rabbinic texts, but kol echad misabim lokeach kazayit min hamatzah hashlishit im kazayit maror. That's basically the sandwich. You take a kazayit of matzah and a kazayit of maror, which somebody said it all depends on how good the horseradish is. Okay, so I'm not teaching a class right now on maror, and I won't weigh in on whether you should have like a huge leaf of romaine lettuce or a huge pile of the grated white stuff that will definitely make you choke. You can combine that however you want. My father, Alav Hasham's custom was to have all the white stuff so that he would choke. It's very fun every year, but basically you want the maror, and some people dip the maror in charoset a little bit. Some people then shake it off. You take the maror, you take the matzah, and you make a sandwich. And I would say that at least in English, our convention is to name a sandwich after the stuff in the middle. So if you take a slice of bread and then you take another slice of bread and you put peanut butter on one slice of bread and you put jelly on the other slice of bread and you put them together, what do you call that sandwich? You definitely don't call it a bread sandwich. You definitely call that a peanut butter and jelly sandwich because we name sandwiches after the middle. But Korech is a very interesting kind of sandwich in this regard. So the text here is about Hillel, and what Hillel would do, Zecher LeMikdash. So Zecher LeMikdash keHillel, Ken asa Hillel bizman shebeit HaMikdash haya kayam. This is what Hillel would do in the time when the Beit HaMikdash actually existed. And then it talks about his sandwich. And the reason that he would put matzah and maror together and have a matzah and maror sandwich, not a matzah sandwich, but a matzah and maror sandwich, was to uphold the kayem mashina emar, to uphold the pasuk that says, al matzot umarorim yochluhu. And I'll just open it in the side here so you can see. It's a little bit of a strange pasuk to look at anyway. I'll open it fully if you want to see. This pasuk about eating the Korban Pesach, because that's what we're talking about, the Korban Pesach, eating it with matzah and maror. It's a little bit of a cheat in this context. This pasuk is actually about Pesach Sheni. It's about the second chance at Pesach, which is a very fun and interesting subject, but probably not what you're thinking about really when you're actually sitting down to do your Seder on Pesach night. But okay, fine, that's the pasuk. And really what the pasuk is about, again, is the Korban Pesach. And this is just how Hillel would eat it. And it's based on these psukim in Sefer Shmot, which do talk about the first Pesach offering. And at the end of this section here, it describes how you take you take the lamb, you sacrifice it. Right? That's the essence of the Korban Pesach experience. And only at the end, as an afterthought, v'achlu et habasar b'layla hazeh tzli esh umatzot al morim yochlu. When you finally get to the part where you've slaughtered your animal and you have your meat and you've smeared the blood, at that point, you can take the meat and you can take it with your matzah and your maror, and that's how you eat it. In other words, this sandwich is missing its middle because the stuff of the sandwich was supposed to be the Korban Pesach. When we say al matzot me'orim yochlu, the thing that you're putting with the maror was supposed to be the meat of the Korban Pesach. How many vegetarians do I have here tonight? Am I offending anyone? It's okay, because it's not relevant right now, because we don't have a Korban Pesach anymore. And so the whole middle of the sandwich is really missing. The whole experience of Korech was designed around the Passover sacrifice, and that's not part of our holiday experience anymore. And really, this is the story of the entire Haggadah in microcosm. We won't have time to discuss it at length, but it's worth thinking about from the very moment you open your Haggadah on, what's it going to be, next Friday night, right? A week from this coming Friday? No, Saturday night, a week from Saturday night. I'm rushing myself. So when you open that Haggadah, the first thing you should think is, if this were back in the temple times, it would be a completely different experience. We'd have to figure out how we were going to shecht an animal and sacrifice an animal, even though it's Shabbat and it's hard enough to imagine preparing a meal, but imagine if you also had to sacrifice a lamb, that would be really complicated. And so that whole component of the Pesach experience was really transformed by the rabbinic system. And I want to say that I think they did a really good job. Rabbi Mish Tzion, who's speaking on recording in the other room, has a beautiful Haggadah published with his father. And there are so many beautiful Haggadot out there. And they're a celebration of the rabbinic experience. But Korech is all that in a microcosm, because what you have is this sandwich that should have been like a hoagie, a club sandwich, a deli sandwich. It should have had meat in the middle, and it doesn't. And you could imagine a world where we might have said, you know what? Forget about Korech. Let's just skip that part of the Seder. It shouldn't be a part of the Seder, really. The Seder is a rabbinic construct. It shouldn't be there at all because we don't have the inside. It's like the peanut butter and jelly sandwich without the peanut butter and jelly. It just doesn't work. You could have imagined skipping it, but instead, the rabbis reinvented it. And we have this Hillel sandwich that gives us a chance to think about really what's missing. And I think that Chazal, my personal opinion, as someone who studies a lot of rabbinic texts and loves them, is that Chazal do such a good job with the rest of the Haggadah that you forget to miss the Korban Pesach most of the time. I think Chazal throw a really good party with the rest of the Seder. But this is a moment to stop and appreciate the missing middle. And so it's a very poignant moment when we can appreciate in its absence the Korban Pesach. And I put a few questions on here that I hope will spark conversations at your Seder should you choose to print this and use this. I am really interested in using this as a moment to think about what are the missing components. I think this is an especially resonant year maybe to think about what's missing at your Seder. What have you had to change or reinvent? Because the Seder is in and of itself a reinvented experience. And that's my first point about Korech. And I have not been checking the chat, but I will. And I'm happy for you to put your questions and your thoughts in the chat as they come up. Here's the second reason that I think that Korech is such a unique and meaningful part of the Seder. I called this section a flavor to savor. And I pulled out a little bit of the Gemara that talks about why Korech. It's a really interesting piece of Gemara. We're going to get to it very soon in like a day or two, I think, in Daf Yomi, for those of you who are following along at home. And the Gemara is talking about a larger issue of mitzvot that are up against one another. I'm not going to obsess over that part right now. But the Gemara says Hillel's the one who had this idea. Hillel's the one who had this idea of, as you know, wrapping matzah and bitter herbs together and eating them. And it quotes the pasuk also and proves that this was Hillel's idea. And then the Gemara says, but you know what? Hillel was in the minority here. Not everyone really thought that this was the way to eat these foods. In fact, the rabbis said, "Afilu ze bifnei atzmo v'ze bifnei atzmo." You don't have to eat the matzah and the maror together with the Korban Pesach. You could eat them separately. And in fact, if you can kind of sing the order of the Seder in your head, you'll remember that if this is the point that we're at in the Seder, like if we're up to Korech, we've already done that. So you've already had motzi matzah and you've already had maror, and you've eaten both of those components separately. And so you've done that already. And the Gemara says, and again, I'm shortening just for the sake of time, but it's a really interesting piece, because usually when we have a machloket, the Gemara decides like which should we do. But the Gemara doesn't do that in this case. Instead, the Gemara says, Hashda delo itmar helchat lo kehilal velo kerabanan. We don't decide the halacha in favor of Hillel, and we don't decide the halacha in favor of the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan say you can eat them sequentially, and Hillel says you've got to eat them all at once. And we don't decide, and so we just kind of hedge our bets. You eat matzah, you eat maror, and then you eat matzah and maror together. And I think this would be a really interesting question to pose to a chef, or maybe to put on like I don't watch cooking shows, but if I did like, Iron Chef or something like that, right? Like a cooking competition, right? What's the difference if you're given a whole bunch of ingredients? What's the difference between just eating them sequentially and having to put them together into a dish? So the rabbis are saying, no, what you need to have is the experience of matzah and the experience of maror, and we can't have the experience of the Korban Pesach anymore. But Hillel says, no, there's something about blending those flavors that's really important. And so we have to do that also. So it's a culinary experience that wants to ask you to experience these flavors at the same time, which is maybe different. If I asked you, and I'd love for you to put your answers in the chat, I'm sorry I can't ask all of you to unmute, but if I asked you, what's the symbolism of matzah? What do you taste when you taste matzah? What do you think you're supposed to be tasting when you taste matzah? Shmura, regular, either way. I think you'd probably all have answers for that. You all have ideas about the symbolism that's evoked by the matzah. And if I ask you, what do you taste when you taste maror? So again, it's going to be a little bit different depending on whether you're someone who eats the grated horseradish fruit or eats the romaine lettuce. But either way, you'll have an idea in your head of what it is that you're supposed to be tasting when you taste maror. And I think matzah, I could imagine a lot of different answers. Matzah is resonant of so many things. It's the chipazon, it's the hurry we were in when we were leaving Egypt. It's also a sign of our redemption. It's also lechem oni, so a sign of our poverty. Miriam said hardship. It definitely does symbolize hardship, but also again, sort of like the hope. And there's also an idea that by having this symbol of something that's unrisen, that's flat, it didn't involve our egos in the same way as bread that's risen. It's a really different and complicated symbol. And maror, I would say, straight up represents the bitterness, the difficulty of our life in Egypt. It's a holdover, right? We're holding on to the piece of the experience from before we left Egypt, even as we're at this festival where we're celebrating our exodus from Egypt. So we're not enslaved anymore, but maror is the symbol of the bitterness. And it's different when you're in the moment, when you're actually, as we imagine ourselves, right? Ki'ilu yatzah miMitzrayim, we all have the obligation to see ourselves as if we left Egypt. So you can be for a little bit in that sequential moment, in that linear experience. Like first we were enslaved in Egypt, that's the maror. Then we rushed and we escaped, and that's the matzah. And so when we eat them sequentially, we're experiencing them maybe a little closer to the way the people actually experienced it as they were leaving Egypt. But hindsight is really different. And I think that I for one, feel this very strongly as I look back now at over a year of pandemic, that everything is different when you look back at it. It feels different. It's sometimes hard to explain even how you experience things in the moment, because everything that happens is now colored by the things that happened afterwards. And that's Korech. It's the sandwich of backwards looking. It's the sandwich of we're here now. We know about the bad parts and we know about the good parts of the exodus from Egypt. And it really is a very complicated story with lots of good and bad parts. And we're going to take all of it together and kind of chew it all up, digest it all together. And that's the experience of Korech. So I gave you some questions to think about here, again, mostly about looking backwards and how it's different to reflect on something that's sad once things are already better, which is hopefully a place that a lot of us are in this year. And I'm not going to test our Zoom capabilities tonight, but if you need something for the children in your life after the fact, maybe not at the Seder, but maybe in preparation for the Seder, I put a clip from the movie Ratatouille on this sheet, which exactly gets to this point. It's a beautiful Disney midrash on the experience of Korech. And if you haven't seen the movie, you should. It's a great thing to watch maybe while you're prepping for Pesach. And in this clip, Ratatouille discovers that it's different, right? He's like a rat on his way to being a chef. He discovers that it's different if you eat the cheese, I think it's mushrooms. If you eat the cheese and the mushrooms separately, like one after the other, then that's different than if you eat them together and then there's like fireworks inside his mouth and it's a completely different transformed experience. I don't know if I would say that Korech rises to that level, but of taste, but at least on a conceptual level, it's meant to. And somebody asked in the chat, what's the good that I mentioned? I think the good part of the matzah is that freedom that we eventually achieve. And so matzah is this symbol, yes, of our oppression, but also ultimately of our freedom. Matzah as lechem oni is also the piece of the Seder that sparks the most questions. The Gemara says, lechem oni, it's the bread about which you answer many questions, oni like oneh. So I think there's lots of good things about matzah, but I guess that's a class for another time. And yes, Michelle, thank you. It is a lot like the wedding. I did think about that the breaking of glass reminds us of the sadness, and we're always meant to kind of blend those experiences. I think it would be so interesting to think about. We could probably generate some other examples also, right, of like Jewish experiences that are meant to blend those two things together. One more piece about Korech before we have to stop. I called this part a sandwich for your spirit, and I'm glad we're well attended by mental health professionals because I have a lot of questions actually about this one. This was sparked for me by a commentary called the Rabbanit Sara, whose existence I did not know about until I started reading his commentary on Sefaria. I don't know if it's printed. I don't have a Haggadah that prints it, and I have a lot of printed Haggadot. But the Rabbanit Sara was a commentary written in the late 18th century by a German rabbi. His name is Yedidya Weil, and I never heard of him, but his father was the Korban Netanel, who's a very important commentary on the Gemara, and I have learned his works before. So the Rabbanit Sara wrote this commentary on the Haggadah that has often very interesting takes, sort of like a little bit outside the rabbinic mainstream. And I also just think in general that in particular, the modern German commentaries on like pretty much anything they're just closer to our reality. They often bring up interesting points. Again, my biased opinion, but I'm a big fan. So what the Rabbanit Sara says here is that the experience of maror korech, he puts them together. So you're going to take the maror and you're going to wrap it. Korech literally means to wrap it. V'af im yiv'ar b'libo is a kintur merirut lev. Even if you have inside your heart some kind of anger, disagreement, bitterness, azai yachrichenu, you should wrap it up. Ritzono lomar al kol ha'peshayim tichaseh ahava. You should, any bad stuff that's inside, you should wrap it in love. And then yadin kol adam l'chav zchut, and then judge all people favorably. And it kind of sounds for a minute like he's saying, just like sweep it under the rug, right? Just push these negative emotions aside. But he makes it really clear that's not what he's saying, because he says there are some people, yesh mishutivo laharichaf, aval bisaro alav yachiv. I love this description. Some people seem like they're being really patient, but it's like killing them inside, right? They're holding on to the pain and it's hurting them so much. They're actually really furious inside. They're actually really, they're not letting go of that pain. And then there are other people with whom the calm is real and they're able to kind of hold on to what happened or to the bitterness, to the anger, but he says they don't allow their hearts to become angry. And he talks about how this is a really great quality, greater than conquering a city, because you're able to kind of hold on to this part. But he says, v'yachrich, you should wrap it up in this softer part, in this, in the love that's going to make this a livable experience for you. Yeah, and Lauren, you said self-compassion, and I think that is definitely a component of it here. And again, it seems to me like a really fine line between just kind of hiding it inside and holding on to it, but saying, but there's other emotions that come to the fore for me now. There's other emotions that I can use to kind of cushion or balance this pain or this anger that's within me. And that's what I'm going to focus on. And that's going to be the focus of of the way that I turn it outward. And I'm especially interested, I think we could have a whole conversation just about this, but I'm especially interested in this idea here Yadin kol adam l'kaf zchut, that if you're doing this successfully, if you're able to hold these emotions in a way that's healthy, that you'll judge other people favorably. Because when I first read this, I thought, it's like a non sequitur. Like, what does it have to do with judging other people favorably? It's about how you feel about yourself and in your own life. And then I thought, no, like probably it is true that you're more likely to judge other people compassionately when you have compassion on yourself. Yeah, I think it is about judging yourself favorably, but also others. I think it's kol adam l'kaf zchut, like really that you're going to be able to empathize with other people if you've, again, held on to that pain, but in a healthy way. So you've learned from it, you've internalized it, but you haven't let it kind of completely color your outlook on life negatively. So again, you could be right, Lauren, but I at least think that it's about turning it outwards as well. And that resonates with me experientially, that when you're grouchy with yourself, you're likely to be grouchy with other people. And when you feel warm in general, that can sort of translate outwards. And I think that is a really important part of the Seder. Again, when we think about it, especially big picture, because we often think that it's best to forget anger, to forget hurt, to forget painful things. But like the whole point of the Seder is to remember. No, Michelle definitely does not think, Dr. Friedman does not think that you should forget bad things. But I think that is something people say, right? At least it's an attitude you've had to work against, right? Like it's, forgive and forget. And it's like, no, that's not a thing. And if you need to prove that that's not a thing, the Haggadah says, let's remember. Let's spend an entire night remembering. And what we're remembering is really complicated. And the truth is, and any of you who are parents or grandparents or uncles or aunts or great-grandparents or educators, you know that it's not actually so simple to tell the story of the Seder or just tell the story of Pesach to young children. All of a sudden, there are parts of the story that we want to edit out. I think my 3-year-old told us that Pharaoh was mean to the Jewish people, was angry at the Jew. Like his teachers have not exactly gone there, and I don't necessarily want them to be clear, because there's a lot of really painful parts of the story. And I think that last year and this year, all of a sudden, the word plague resonated really differently with us than it had previously. At least I can say that for myself and a lot of my peers and friends who I was speaking with last year. I think that will be true again. So there are these really painful parts of the story that we are meant to not kind of cover up, but just wrap up. And we wrap it inside other things. We wrap it inside this larger textual experience. We wrap it inside these more delicious foods. And we remember the bitterness of Egypt. We remember being slaves. It's probably the most central experience of Judaism that we remember, but we're meant to translate that experience into empathy for other people. And really that's at the core of the Seder story. That's every other time that we talk about Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim, or remember that you were slaves in Egypt. So often what we're talking about is remembering to be empathetic towards others. And so we're trying to make it into a story that can include everybody, right? A story that you can somehow tell even with the young people at your table, or even with people who don't like certain parts of the story. You may or may not read the entire Haggadah, and that's between you and your family or whoever else is sharing your Seder. But I think that there are definitely multiple ways to tell the story. Even within the Haggadah itself, there are multiple ways to tell the story. And we need to tell the story and think about the story in a way that holds on to all those negative aspects. I would never advocate for just entirely editing them out. But at the same time, we want to hold that inside of this larger whole, this larger, more meaningful whole that directs us towards love and towards empathy and helps us to actually do something productive with that experience. So that is the third reason that I think that Korech is the most meaningful sandwich. I do think that you see these themes, these messages that I talked about, really all three of them, I think, play out in different ways throughout the Haggadah. So if you want, I usually like to give the children and non-children at my Seder a challenge in reading through the Haggadah every year to make it a little bit different. So sometimes it's about Midrash and identifying different types of Midrash, and I taught a class about that earlier this week, or that was last week, whatever. And this challenge, I think, is to try to pick up some of these threads and see how you see them developing throughout the Haggadah and not just in Korech. Okay. Now we have the dreaded 54 seconds till breakout rooms close, but I will take any final questions you have until we all get magically transported into the main room. And I thank you so much for being here and wish you all a Chag Kasher V'Sameach.